Hi, I'm Spencer Downey, and today, along with Jalissa Dixon, Joey Staffield, Hunter Manning, and Alex Wright, I will be presenting Cola Wars, the battle for soda supremacy. Before we get too in depth into the Cola Wars, I think there are a few things you should all keep in mind during the length of this presentation. The first is that the bulk of this war was between 1975 and 1995. Both Pepsi and Coke achieved huge annual growth at this time, around 10% a year, both globally and in the US for both of those companies. Number two is while the war was a competition between the two companies, were both benefited from it. Pepsi and Coke executives have both said since that without the other, they wouldn't have been able to drive themselves forward to constantly be trying to outdo one another. So Pepsi, Coke, and the consumer all ultimately benefited from this war. And last, it can't be understated how much Americans' appetites grew for these soft drinks during this time. Without the consumer, there would be no cola wars, and you know these soft drinks became a huge part of the food and drink marketplace in America during these times. So now I'm going to pass it on to Hunter Manning to talk about market share.
Thanks, Spence. In 1950, Alfred Steele, a former Coca-Cola marketing executive, became Pepsi's CEO. He launched the Beat Coke campaign and introduced the first 26-ounce bottler focusing on family consumptions. Pepsi's growth followed the growth of supermarkets and retail stores during the expanding economy of the 60s. By 1970, Pepsi had narrowed Coke's lead to a 2-to-1 margin, and their bottlers were on average larger than Coke's. They also explored non-soda related markets by purchasing snack giant Frito-Lay. PepsiCo had doubled in size from 1950 to 1970, while Coke's executives still refused to acknowledge their main competitor. In 1974, the Pepsi Challenge campaign was launched with the goal to prove that consumers preferred Pepsi in a blind taste test. It was so successful that by 1979, Pepsi finally surpassed Coke in food store sales by a 1.4 share lead. In 1979, the president of Coke did the unthinkable and mentioned Pepsi by name in a bottlers conference.
Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the war in the 1980s. The first big thing to happen between these two giants in the 1980s was Robert Guizetta being named CEO of Coca-Cola in 1980. Guizetta's first move is to go from sugar to corn syrup in the Coca-Cola formula. Pepsi would follow in 3 years. Another thing Pepsi would follow Coke on would be increasing advertising costs. Coke goes from $74 million spent on advertising to $181 million, and Pepsi increases from $66 million to $125 million. But not everything Guizetta did worked out well. Guizetta, after seeing Coca-Cola's market share fall both to Pepsi and other soft drink manufacturers, decided that Coca-Cola needed to change its formula even further. New Coke was created, which was a sweeter version of the older Coke, which now became classic Coca-Cola. When Coca-Cola released the drink, Pepsi gave its workers a day off and declared it a holiday. The taste was so similar to Pepsi's that Pepsi saw this as a sign that they had the superior soda and that they were setting the marketplace for taste. Soon after, Coca-Cola would take New Coke and rebrand it to Coke 2, and Classic Coca-Cola would become the mothership brand of Coke again. But despite this blunder, the 80s were still a successful time for Coca-Cola. Guizetta's next big move was to create Diet Coke. Diet Coke was a huge success and became the third overall selling soft drink in the market and the number one selling diet drink. It was even named the most successful product launch of the 1980s. Breaking away from the timeline of the war, I'd like to talk a little bit about the bottling process and the distribution channels. So bottlers have very little buying power. They have retail agreements, so they're the ones who actually go and stock the shelves at your local store with Pepsi or Coke. Coke was the first to build a nationwide franchise bottling network, and as far as those bottling manufacturers and bottling plants go, 60% of what they do is in metal cans, so little single servers, and 38% are in plastic bottles, with the remaining 2% being put into miscellaneous promotional bottles and packaging. For Coca-Cola, 1987 was the year they created their master bottling contract. They were not obligated to help bottlers with media and advertising, and the price of the ingredients was based on the price of the sweeteners and had a maximum price set. Pepsi's was a little bit different as it had bottlers buy the raw materials directly from Pepsi at Pepsi's price. These franchise agreements Pepsi and Coca-Cola went into did allow the bottlers to create non-cola brand or to bottle non-cola brands, but these brands could not be directly competitive with one another. So Pepsi and Coke could not be bottled at the same facility. These agreements also gave decision-making control to bottlers when it comes to retail price, new packaging, selling, advertising, and promotions, but they had to be approved by the franchising. As far as these channels that the bottlers took advantage of, main distribution was supermarkets, followed by warehouse clubs and drugstores. And then the other big distribution was through the fountain market. So whenever you go to a place that you're putting your cup up to a fountain and getting your drink that way, that's a huge market, and it's only going to get bigger into the 2000s. And we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Now I want to look at the barriers of entry into the cola manufacturing business. If this industry has been so profitable, why can't other firms enter the industry successfully? Let's look at brand equity and cumulative spending on advertising. For one, Coke and Pepsi have established brand identity over a long period of time. They have become part of the American culture and have worldwide identities. There's also limited shelf space, vending slots, and fountains. So there's limited places for the new soft drinks to be placed. The first one to fill the slots has to be displaced, which is often more costly than moving into open channels. With regards to bottling, the franchise system is very capital comprehensive. It costs roughly $6 billion to build national distribution, and bottlers have exclusive arrangements with Coke and Pepsi for colas, which are 2/3 of the demand. For the scale economies in advertising, because Pepsi and Coke have a strong brand equity, they get more bang for their buck. For example, Coke spent about $10 million per share point in advertising, while 7-Up has to spend more than double with $22 million per share point. Now let's look at substitution. How can soft drink companies charge more money when other alternatives are healthier and less costly? These substitutions can include water, milk, fruit juice, and coffee. Some reasons for these substitutions not being selected. For one, these substitutions are not always conveniently available. Also, purchasing soft drinks most of the time is an impulse buy. Coke and Pepsi have become lifestyle choices, and they are now part of how we live, not just how we quench our thirst. There's also an addiction aspect to it. According to Andy Pearson, about half of the consumption of Coke was consumed by people that drank an average of 8 cans per day. Americans also drink more soft drinks than any other beverage by a huge margin, and in some foreign countries, drinking Coke and Pepsi is a status symbol. So what about suppliers? Do suppliers have any real power over the concentration of manufacturers? Who are the suppliers? Plastic bottle manufacturers, but they also have no say of the cola production, and they do not even know the ingredients. So what goes into the cola? Do they really not know? Well, there's no sugar added by the bottlers. There's no water added by them either. It's a secret. No one knows. How much do you think these ingredients cost? The fact is, not very much. So let's look at the buyers. How much power do we have? Which buyers do manufacturers focus on? Well, bottlers have very little power, even if they are independent. They also deal with high switching costs. Franchise agreements are locked in for these guys, and they also have exclusive deals. They concentrate on 35% of cost of goods sold and to the bottler, but buying powers focus on buying powers for the cans and sugar. There's also competitors that are very concentrated and are large relative to the bottling network historically. Coke itself had 800 bottlers. Today, Coke and Pepsi exercise direct control over the bottling network. So now we're going to look at the final customers. How many? Well, there's billions worldwide. It's somewhat price sensitive, but it's susceptible to advertising, which, as we know, are commercials like the Super Bowl. There's also no switching costs, but substitutes are not always available. So when you look at the rivalry, who's really winning? It's Coke and Pepsi. And who's losing? It's everyone else.
The 1990s brought new challenges to both Coke and Pepsi. While in the past it was Coke versus Pepsi and Pepsi versus Coke, now both of these companies were competing with a market that didn't have the same interest in soft drinks that they had in years past. While growth was still positive, it was slow, and it was unlike the huge growth numbers that we saw in the 1980s, early 90s, and late 70s. Another challenge facing Coca-Cola was that popular CEO Robert Guizetta had passed away, and their new CEO had to face racial discrimination lawsuits and a PR nightmare in Europe from contaminated soft drinks. So it was a rough start to the second half of the 1990s. As Coke and Pepsi saw this reduced growth, they both decided they needed to raise prices. This was met with less consumption in supermarkets, and sales began to drop even more. In order to try to boost these sales, Coke made licensing and advertising deals with the Harry Potter brand, and Pepsi hired Britney Spears to endorse the Pepsi brand. Pepsi even tried to bring back the Pepsi Challenge in order to boost cola sales and draw people back to the carbonated drink market, which was now seeing less and less attention. While the early 90s and the late or the throughout the 80s and 70s, supermarkets were the must-have marketplace for both these companies. Now fountains were the main focus. Coke was able to remain the king of the fountains, but Pepsi broke in, wrestling away Disney, Disney Quest, Club Disney, and ESPN Zone chains. So you could see how this fountain market was extremely competitive. Pepsi even sued Coke because they said that Coke was attempting to monopolize the market for fountain dispensed soft drinks through independent food service distribution throughout the United States. Coke persuaded federal courts to dismiss the lawsuit in 2000. Despite all of these efforts by Pepsi, like I said earlier, Coke was still the king of the fountain market with 65% of shares nationally, and Pepsi held only 21% of these fountains. Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about globalization and the cola wars. As domestic demand plateaued in the late 90s, Coca-Cola and Pepsi both had to find ways to compete and continue to have growth. They looked globally to make up for these losses. While Coke had already established dominance overseas, Pepsi was finding new emerging markets like China and India in order to outdo their competitor. One Pepsi executive said instead of bashing their heads in trying to make an impact in places that Coke has had for 20 years, they needed to find new and emerging markets, and that's what they did. While there was still some challenges to this strategy, such as cultural differences, both Pepsi and Coke found ways to make it work. These included Pepsi going into India and finding extremely successful businessmen in each city and using their connections to get their product out, and Coke using different vending machines in Japan, which ended up being one of their most successful product distribution channels in the whole nation of Japan. The future of the cola wars really hinges on the global marketplace. Whoever can best adapt and control the emerging markets will ultimately win the cola wars. And this goes along with growth, as there still is room to grow as countries in Africa and countries in the Middle East and the countries in South America begin to have more money and ability to buy consumer goods like Coca-Cola and Pepsi products. That concludes our presentation. Thank you for your time.